Good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon. We are delighted to have with us today Sarah Chase, who is going to speak on the topic Government in the Public Interest Under Assault, ? And as many of you know, Sarah Chase has a distinguished and very interesting background with which she's going to inform our thinking about what is happening in the world today. In the book that many of you have read, I know some of you are in Elaine Dzinski's class and have read Thieves of State. This is a prize-winning book that makes a powerful argument about how corruption breeds extremism. She has witnessed this firsthand, spending many years in the Middle East. She worked for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, for many years after he came to see her point of view that corruption really is a core problem in American foreign policy. And so I think it's fair to think of her now as a gadfly in chief of American foreign policy and domestic governance as well. We're going to let you say whatever more you want to say about your background and how that informs where you are today. I would just say one more thing for those of you who have not read this book. It is beautifully written. It is informed by deep experience, and it has amazing scholarly erudition. She draws on her work on medieval Islamic thought and quotes scholars from hundreds of years ago who saw at that time that corruption was a danger to governance. And so please join me in welcoming Sarah Chase to the podium.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I mean, it's not like words are, something you don't have enough of to absorb in this life. So I really appreciate those of you who weren't compelled to show up, those of you, and you too. Corruption, favorite topic, right? And so we are going to spend most of the afternoon talking about it. But first, I'd like to kind of take a step back to talk about that stuff. Money. I would like to suggest that we're living at a time, and obviously it's the root of all evil, and I got that, and there's plenty I could do, probably plenty more scholarly work on what people think about money. But I do think that it ebbs and flows, and that we're living at a particular period in history where money has displaced. Are you not hearing me well? Oh, I see. Okay, so that means I have to stay here, or I can use this one.
No, that's not the house mic either. That's fine.
You mean you're going to put me in a cage back here? Wow. So we're living at a time when money has displaced, supplanted, if you will, other values in how we measure our social standing, right? Other values like wisdom or contributions to the community or creativity or insight, public service. And it's really become the way of measuring social standing. It's the way of keeping score, if you will. And by the way, it doesn't really matter where it comes from. I spent about 2.5 weeks in Nigeria, literally asking people everywhere, north and south, both major, actually most major religions, different social classes, whether the meaning of money had changed in their lifetime. And the answers I got were both emphatic and surprising. It was absolutely yes. And it was things like people use money to intimidate other people. Oh, really? How? By giving it to them. If somebody gives you money, then you can't tell the truth anymore. I was like, wow, that's really interesting. But I also got that it used to be that it mattered where your money came from. And everyone had a story about how he had found money on the ground and was so terrified about taking it home and not being able to explain where the money had come from that it was like, Ellen, did you lose the money? I mean, literally giving it to passersby. And now they say it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you bring it home, bring the money home. To the village, people told me, now they're celebrating. There will be on television the fancy weddings of very rich people. They're celebrating the people who loot the public treasury. That means what we're in is a competition. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say, when is enough? And the point is, it's not about what you're going to do with the money. It's a competition for zeros in bank accounts. It's not about need. It's about winning. And that means there are no limits. And that has some really significant implications in terms of how much natural resources and human labor and human creativity need to get converted into cash in order to create more zeros in the competitors' bank accounts. To compete in this race, elites everywhere, and I mentioned Nigeria, but I think everything I'm going to say applies to the United States. Elites are rewriting rules or selectively enforcing them in their own favor. That's what ordinary people mean when they talk about corruption or rigged systems or a swamp. That's what ordinary people mean. But the elites, meanwhile, at the same time, are also narrowing the definition of corruption. Right? So while they're busily rigging the system, you have, for example, what I thought was the most significant event in the campaign season. I guess I was probably wrong given what we're now learning about the campaign season in 2016, but at the time, it was not, the latest outrageous statement or the latest leak. It was, in fact, a Supreme Court decision in June, I think, of 2016, overturning the conviction for corruption of then Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. 8-0. That shocked me even more than the decision itself. The acts were constituted. In other words, there was no question that this guy the governor had taken a bunch of money, like $180,000 worth of stuff, right? His daughter's wedding and free trips and loans and a little bit of cash and this and that, in order to lean on the State Department of Education to do clinical trials on some quack medicine that the briber wanted to sell. The quid pro quo was established in the conviction. In fact, he'd get a call from the businessman, and 5 minutes later, he'd make the call to the Secretary of State for Education. But the conviction was thrown out because the Supreme Court did not deem that effort to constitute official acts. That's what the federal bribery statute says, is it has to be in return for an official act. Now, if you're calling your subordinate from your telephone in, the governor's mansion, I don't understand why that's not an official act, but that's where the Supreme Court went. As a result, basically, to commit corruption legally in the United States, at this point, you basically need to be jailed for stupidity to actually do something that would now count as corruption. I think that, and some of you are taking a class and one of you is teaching a class on corruption in this room, and I suspect that some of your readings may seem a little bit technical. I think that's another way that corruption is kind of underestimated. Is it seen as a kind of technical, often an isolated thing that isolated individuals do, opportunistic, and therefore liable to be addressed with technical solutions. So you hear a lot of those. Or, how many of you have studied or taught fragile and failing states? That wonderful expression. So that's what I heard a lot about it. Was, they're fragile and failing states, and corruption sort of seeps in like some kind of a, cancer or a disease. I think none of these definitions are sufficient to what we're dealing with today. I think that what we're actually dealing with is not so much fragile or failing governments, but rather extremely successful criminal organizations that are masquerading as governments. Corruption in 60 to 70 countries that I've been looking at worldwide, I know that's pretty provocative language, but is the operating system of these networks, which are not indeed successful in governing. But that's not their objective. That's their objective. That stuff, money. Money for network members. That is what they are, that's their aim. By network, what do I mean? In Thieves of State, I focus on vertical integration of networks. And that's because that's what we discovered. I mean, I fell into this issue in Afghanistan, not because, I was there to kind of do reconstruction work. I wasn't planning on focusing on rule of law or governance or anything like that, but Afghans were screaming. That's all they could talk about, was how they were being shaken down by their government. And so I started working it, and eventually, like 8 years in, I'm working for the command at the military command at what's called ISAF, the International Military Headquarters in Kabul, and we start working some corruption cases. And what we discovered is, so we went after a kind of two-bit police official. He was a border police official. You know what? Come on, don't be shy. Come on down front. And there's plenty of room both in front and around the other side.
If I was shy, I wouldn't come to hear you.
That's exactly right. Or maybe some of you folks could even scoot down just to make it, there we go. Boy, they disposed of a faculty appointment really fast, didn't you? Two faculty appointments. So a friend of mine had been mentoring Afghan police in doing this pretty complex, white-collar crime stuff, and they learned how to do judicial wiretaps, and they learned how to, do bank records and all this stuff. They had this great evidence on this relatively unimportant border police official. I knew him. And it's like, I even said, let's not even bother with this. This guy doesn't matter. Oh, we got all the evidence. Let's go for it. So I watched President Karzai throw himself across the railroad tracks to prevent that arrest from going down, and I could not figure it out. And eventually, what kind of the epiphany was, the police officer on the street who shakes you down, the clerk who shakes you down when you need an official document, the doctor who shakes you down in order to be treated, they don't just put that money in their pocket. They owe some of it up the line. That's what I mean by vertical integration. And it turns out to be true everywhere I've looked at this, is that the cop, in fact, in Uzbekistan, for example, you have young men going into debt to buy their position in the police. The whole village will chip in to get their kid a job in the police. Then the poor kid has to pay back the village and continue paying the monthly things up the line. Now, what goes down the line in return is impunity. And that's why President Karzai threw himself across the railroad tracks, because it doesn't matter how unimportant that police official is down the line. If there is some indication to the system that the guarantee of impunity is not a firm and solid guarantee, well, heck, they're going to stop sending their money up the line. That's the deal. The whole system will collapse. So that's what I learned there, and that's what I really talk about in Thieves of State. What I've been working on since then is horizontal integration. So, here we were in Afghanistan. We were looking primarily at, insurgents and things like that. But let's take Latin America, where I've looked, more recently. I've done a bit of work on Honduras. So in Latin America, for example, U.S. officials are really concerned about transnational organized crime, right? The bad guys in that context are the drug dealers, just as the bad guys in the Afghan context are the insurgents. So from the perspective of somebody who goes after transnational organized crime, sorry, now I really have to sit, but this is terrible. guys, no, it's not terrible. I'm used to wandering around a little bit more, but
You can wander around, but you'll just have to speak loudly.
yeah, but I think it's tough on some people because it goes all the way back. So I'll stick with it for now. But just imagine, if you will, that I'm wandering there. From the perspective of, cop shows on the TV or people who focus on organized crime, the corrupt official is like the supporting actor in the drama. The organized criminals, they are the lead, and the corrupt official is the supporting actor. In our, here in America, we could get into a fist fight, probably even within this room, about who's worse for your health, the public sector or the private sector. Right? What I'm getting at is we see those three sectors as fundamentally separate and different and distinct. In these kleptocratic networks, they weave all the way together. So it's not like organized crime, gets one person here or one person there. These are fully integrated kleptocratic networks. Just as an example, there was a gigantic case in New York, a Honduras case, wherein the son of the former president of Honduras pled guilty to moving over a ton of cocaine into the United States in combination with the biggest Mexican and Colombian drug cartels, and one of the major banks was laundering the money. So that's the network right there, drug dealing, government officials, and the main private sector. In Azerbaijan, another country I've looked at, the president's family owns 11 banks. They own the entire financial services industry. So these networks will look different in different countries. They will be more or less consolidated, like Azerbaijan's is very consolidated. Honduras is a little bit more separate. There's overlap between public, private, and criminal sectors in terms of personnel, but largely the network is held together by a very thick tissue of exchanges. Now, and here's where we really get into government by and for the people, right? The job of the members of the network who are in government office is to bend their agencies or institutions to serve not the public interest, but the interests of the network. That's what I mean by, that's the rigged system right there. And, I have a couple of, I didn't bring them, but I have a couple of infographics, like PowerPoints, that look at different countries and which sector, government institutions are fully captured. Almost always the judiciary, right? Because if you're going to guarantee impunity or be able to punish the people you want to punish, you need to own the judiciary. It's not always the case, and they don't get every single one. So, for example, in Egypt, President Sisi has been assiduously expanding the jurisdiction of the military courts because he can't control the civilian courts. They're still a little bit independent. They still have a certain amount of professional, ethics and stuff like that. So he can't guarantee the outcome in civilian courts. And I don't know if you remember, but in the whole period after Tahrir Square, demonstrators were, and even then it was before Sisi, but still they were being put before military courts. And there was a big push saying civilians shouldn't be put before military courts. Well, now it's even expanding. In South Africa, the courts also remain quite independent and were really holding the line, and it was the public prosecution that was particularly captured. So that kind of thing. In Honduras, there's something called the Qualianza. So I'm like, what's the Qualianza? Qualianza is an agency that signs the contracts for big infrastructure projects or programs, which are often public-private partnerships. Exactly what we're being, anyone hear about a $1.5 trillion anything, right? Public-private partnership. What happens is once it's a public-private partnership, the money is moved off of the budget process. So it is free from public procurement, obligations, and it's secret. And in fact, what I heard is some of the banks that are holding the trust funds for some of these projects, which are part of the network, even they are saying, I'm not sure I want any more of these, because the government officials who are on the governing council of the particular project are siphoning so much off into their own pockets. So Qualianza was one that for Honduras I included. So you can imagine. And then the government agencies that you can't actually capture. I mean, in Honduras also, it's a little bit of a, the current president, when he had finished being president of Congress, so he ran for president as basically the Speaker of the House. And so in the time between he took office as president, in the middle of the night, he had Congress fire 4 out of 5 Supreme Court justices, pack the court, because there's a presidential term limit there was in the Honduran Constitution. So just before he becomes president, he already knows he wants to run for a second term. He changes the Supreme Court, which dutifully, a year later, strikes down the constitutional term limit. Juan Orlando Hernandez just won re-election in a very questionable election. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. You either take over or hollow out government institutions. And hollowing them out can mean not appointing people to open positions. It can mean not paying them. It can mean rotating competent officials frequently or sending them essentially to Siberia. There was a really extraordinary version of this in 2014 when the militaries of Iraq, Nigeria, and Ukraine collapsed almost simultaneously because each of them had been essentially hollowed out, cannibalized by the kleptocratic networks that were running those countries. One other point I just want to mention on the private sector side. So on the private sector, that can get really diabolical. Like Tunisia, Tunisia doesn't have oil. One of its really lucrative export products is dates, the fruit, because Muslims the world over break their Ramadan fast with dates. In particular in the Gulf, that's a big market, and Tunisia grows fantastic dates. So what's the constraint for growing dates? Water, right? They grow in oases. Now, I used to think that the trees just grow in the oasis and they try to get water. Well, we're in the modern age. Now there's a public water department that delivers. The water is, in pipes and it's delivered to the different orchards. So I'm Bin Ali's son-in-law. I want your dates and I want them at a certain price. And I tell you what price I'm going to take your dates for. And if you protest, tomorrow you don't have any water. The tax authorities in country after country, now I know we can get pissed off at the IRS and stuff like that, but in country after country, Tunisia being one, Uzbekistan being another, what I found out is that taxes are sort of conditionally forgiven. So if you have a business that the network wants a piece of, so long as you give them the piece, you don't have to pay any taxes. But let's say they come back and say, 17% isn't enough. I want 23%. You say, I can't possibly give you 23%. I won't, stay afloat. Bang. Tomorrow you're audited for millions of dollars. So the tax authorities become not a revenue generation for public services. So it's not a way of generating revenue in order to pay for teachers and roads and trains and things like that, but instead it's a weaponization to keep people, or it's a weapon to keep people in line. There's another really important aspect of this, which is external enablers. So how many of you heard about the Panama Papers? Or Paradise Papers, right. So what those are, secrecy jurisdictions, the law firms and registered agents that create the phony companies for you in secrecy jurisdictions, the banks that, accept deposits from corporations that are made in the name of a cat, that's a kind of enabler. That's a one cat, that's really true, that actually happened. Somebody, did it in Delaware. With the picture of the cat, too. Oh, I think I'd like to have this corporation in the name of my cat. Isn't he cute? And sure enough, she was able to register the corporation. Those are sort of service providers, right? I mean, it's kind of first come, first serve. It's whoever you pays your money and you get your service. There are other types of enablers that are even more kind of painful to think about. So I'm going to do one that's going to hit really close to home. 2 or 3 years ago, this university gave an honorary degree to Ngozi, and she's got a hyphenated last name, the last part of which is Ikweala. She was the finance minister of Nigeria, who presided over the loss of $1 billion a month in oil revenues that never made it into the public coffers. I'm not asserting that she stole any of that money. I do know that she was finance minister when that was going on. I know that her colleague, the governor of the central bank, found the evidence, provided a long memo with lots of documentation to the Senate, the Nigerian Senate, and was fired, and she never opened her mouth, and she has never from that day to this said a negative word about the then president of Nigeria, either in private or in public. And in private, I know because I know the people in the State Department. So I was asking, was she even saying stuff? Was she providing you any information behind the scenes? Nope. That's not the kind of person who deserves a Yale honorary degree. And it happens all over the place. And I'm picking on you guys because it happens to be a case that I got involved in because I knew the chairman of your board of trustees. And so I wrote her a letter saying, Margie, how can you possibly be doing this? But it happens all over the place. I mean, think tanks are classics for this. And I've argued also with Carnegie. They invited an Afghan official that I was extremely unhappy about, but it had already happened by the time I found out about it. And that's, I get it that there are free speech issues, and this is a little bit different from free speech. This is awarding people honors. And these people are as interested in laundering their images as they are in laundering their money. And so it becomes a very important role, I think, for prestigious institutions to be a little bit careful about to whom they are providing this kind of award. Development assistance is another really incredible one. And on the Honduras effort, I looked at development financing, which I hadn't really examined before. So what those are banks that are public institutions. So I picked on, again, I like picking on the nice people, right? Finland, one of the most wonderful countries in the world, extremely clean and uncorrupt itself. They have something called FinFund, which is their development bank. And the thesis is, if we, ally with the private sector to provide loans rather than just giving away development assistance, we'll be able to leverage more money and get more of that stuff into the picture and therefore presumably have more development. Well, I think there's some folks I understand who have been in Iraq as well as Afghanistan in the audience here. And we know, those of us who have been in those two theaters, that there were no constraints on money. There was no limit on the quantity of development money that got injected into those two theaters. Did that produce any more development? Not really. I mean, I would submit that it's how you target the money rather than the quantity of dollars that really makes the difference. And so what I found with the development banks is the Finnish foreign ministry puts money in FinFund. It's layered, just like the secrecy jurisdictions, right? Finnish foreign ministry puts money into FinFund, which puts money into something called the Central America Mezzanine Infrastructure Fund, with some undisclosed number of other investors. So already I can't even know the totality of who else is invested in that fund. FinFund did not disclose to the Finnish population how much of their money it had invested in CAMF, which is pretty shocking. Like, why does that have to be secret? And then, of course, the development requirements. The people who are then investing CAMF into projects in Central America, what are the criteria? Well, that's secret too, because there's a whole variety of investors. And so I, working on the issue, could not get from the FinFund CEO what are the criteria. Then I go to find the managers of CAMF, and they turn out to be a regular old private equity firm based in Washington, D.C., that also manages the money of the Sultan of Brunei. So what I found, and then I talked to FinFund about money that they had invested directly, and it was really interesting, in a project that resulted in the assassination of an absolutely wonderful environmental and social activist a couple of years ago. And it was like Stockholm Syndrome. They said, our clients are good people. At least they're not putting their money in Swiss banks. At least they're reinvesting it in, hydroelectric dams and stuff like that. Well, golly, that's because they can make way more money on the hydroelectric dams in Honduras than they could in a Swiss bank, because the system is rigged. So hydroelectric dams count as renewable energy. They get 10% above market rate for the duration of the contract, which is 30 years, for quote-unquote renewable energy, plus a 3 cent per kilowatt hour bonus, plus the government guarantees it will buy every single kilowatt that they generate, so no risk. That's what, and then they don't even have to get the money because they're getting money from development banks, right? That's why they're putting their money in. And it was fascinating when this whole project blew up in the face of FinFund. And at the end of the interview, I said, did you learn anything from this? Like, is there anything that you would do differently as a result of this? And they said, yeah. It's not enough to have a good project. You have to really look at the context in which, and I said, yes, they got it, And they said, you really have to see whether there's some powerful NGO that's able to, whip up world opinion against such a good project. And, then you have to abandon a really good project if you're up against an NGO like that. I mean, I'm filling in the dots, but that's what they said. So the completely battered down Lenca indigenous movement, that was the powerful NGO. So sorry for that long riff on enablers, but the reason I pause there is because there are all kinds of ways of being an enabler. I wrote this big, nasty report about Honduras, and the biggest bank in Central America, which has just been fingered for laundering some of the money from, that guy who's dealing drugs who pled guilty in New York. Not his money, but his mother. Wait, that's one other thing I wanted to point out on the private sector. Charity. Foundations. I've seen it everywhere. So in Uzbekistan, the daughter of the president had a charity that was called Fund Forum, and that was basically her black box. So if I wanted to invest in the telecom sector in Uzbekistan, I would have to pay the 27% to her, but I also every once in a while would have to make a contribution into Fund Forum, and if I didn't, the towers would go down and my customers wouldn't have any signal. So the Clinton Foundation. Let me just be very explicit, right? I mean, I don't know that influence was actually bought. What I do, and I presume they've got enough lawyers that they stayed inside the letter of the law. That being said, when the King of Morocco puts money into the Clinton Foundation, he certainly believes that he's buying influence. So that's why that one is so sensitive. So I kind of dwell on this because, as I say, all of this applies to us. I wrote this report on Honduras. The biggest bank in Central America sued Carnegie for defamation, which they're not going to win, right? They, as I say, they're laundering the money that Lobo's wife put into one of these charities in order to steal welfare funds. So there were welfare funds designed for giving kids backpacks and building various infrastructure projects, and she was siphoning that off, and it was running through this bank. I was going to write an op-ed about something else to do with Honduras. My boss said, Sarah, come on, knock it off while we've got this case going on. Really interesting, huh? They don't need to win the case. They're a bank. They have infinite money. What they were trying to do was stop people from, looking too closely. And it worked. So I'm not going to say that Carnegie is an enabler, but I'm going to say there's a whole bunch of what I would call soft enablers. People who go to work at prestigious institutions. We don't have to work too hard at Carnegie. We don't have to actually teach classes or anything like that. We have a decent salary. We don't have to show up on Fridays in the summertime. It's a kind of cushy, and we get to be, have a good guy's uniform, so long as we don't actually really get in the way too much. And I think that's led to some of where we are now in the United States. I think that we've all been asleep at the switch as our own kleptocratic system has been developing and kind of crystallizing and reinforcing itself over the last 2 or 3 decades. Note that this is ideology-free. It's really critical. Back in the 20th century, we had this idea that there were these ideologies pitted against each other. Now, the threat to government in the public interest is ideology-free. And I've seen it both here, so I've just mentioned the left-right versions of it in the US. I've seen it in Latin America, where Venezuela and Brazil cut one way, and Honduras and Guatemala cut the other way, and each one is as kleptocratic as the other. And so saying this is about too much public sector involvement in the political economy or too much private sector involvement of the political economy is wrong. It's about what are the checks and what is the oversight on how the political economy runs. You see it in genuinely authoritarian countries like Azerbaijan, and you see it in, at least nominal democracies. By legalizing and normalizing kleptocratic practices, those countries can slip toward becoming kleptocracies. And in that context, electoral politics starts to look to ordinary people a lot more like intra or inter-network rivalry, not really, about who's got better public policies. And that's why a lot of people don't vote. And that's why a lot of the indigenous people in Honduras were saying, hey, after a while, we realized these two parties, neither of them had our interests at heart, but they were pitting us against each other. Doesn't that sound familiar? A couple of other characteristics of kleptocratic governance in our day and age, a lot of that stuff, right? We're not talking petty crime here. $1 billion a month in Nigeria, that's a lot of money. It's not victimless, and this is really critical. It's not even as indirect as we often think it is. So the victims are, of course, all of us who are lacking in, are not receiving the type of public service and government in our interest that we deserve. That is our inalienable right. But, when you get shaken down by a cop on a road in southern Afghanistan or northern Nigeria, they don't ask you nicely, right? And if they did, you'd probably, are you Afghan by any chance? Yeah. What's your name? Adam. Adam?
Yes.
So Adam, you've got a cousin in the force. You know how low our salaries are, right? I've got 3 kids at home, and I need shoes for my youngest. Could you please help me out? The guy would pull the money out of his pocket and give it to me. But that's not how it happens. You get insulted, you get treated with contempt, you get smacked, you get, And, and I start Thieves of State with this story where it's one of my guys, or one of my kind of extended family, who got smacked in the face by a police officer because he refused to pay the bribe. And I thought we would have to bail him out of jail. I mean, you are a 20-something-year-old Afghan male, former member of the police himself. You've got dignity, and sometimes that's all you've got. And so, and that's money, right? And we've been talking about that stuff. But when I had this conversation with justice sector professionals in northern Nigeria, a prosecutor said, Sarah, you're just talking about money, but it's not just about money. So in the Me Too era, this was before the Me Too era, he tells me about the judge who had a guy in on preventive detention who's diabetic. The guy's wife begs the judge, says, please, he's diabetic. I have to give him his medicine. I promise I will deliver him to the courtroom on time. The judge takes advantage of her. That's another version of Me Too, right? It's called sextortion. And that's really what went on with Weinstein. That was sextortion. It was not sexual harassment is another way of putting it. Sexual assault is another way, but it's extortion, but not for money, for services. As a female, you all know how I feel about that. As a security professional, I'm thinking about my guy in the cop in Kandahar, and I'm thinking about this lady's brother. What does he want to do? He wants to shoot the judge, just like my guy wanted to shoot the cop. And when you live in southern Afghanistan or northern Nigeria, you almost have to try not to join Boko Haram or the Taliban. There's plenty of people who want you to shoot the cop, right? So you get smacked in the face by a cop enough times, you're going to want to pick up that gun and shoot him, or some of them will. And so this is how we get to extremism. And I can develop that argument further. There actually is a pretty interesting argument because a lot militant puritanical religious movements make an anti-corruption argument. And that's true in Islam today, as I say, the militant puritanical wing of Islam today, and it was true in Christianity in our own history in the Netherlands, in Puritans. They were making the same argument. They were radical religious extremists making an anti-corruption argument, actually. And so I'll give away the punchline a little bit, but there's a place, so John Locke, right? Who's had to read him? Yeah. I didn't, but it's actually really worth reading. I read him when I didn't in school, and I read him as I was working on Thieves of State, and I found, I let out a yell when I found the following thought. When there is a barefaced wresting of the law, like grabbing of the law, to basically, I think he uses the word indemnify, but it's to serve the purposes of a man or a party of men, war is made on the sufferers. Very strong language. War is made on the sufferers who, lacking an appeal on earth to right them, will turn to the only remedy in such cases, an appeal to heaven. So he's basically predicting violent religious insurgency as a reaction to systemic corruption. It's pretty cool. So I laid that side by side with it, and if I had the book, I could. Does anyone have the book? Yeah? Let me see if I can find this quickly. Thank you. If I get it fast. Nope, not there. Yeah. Sorry, let me just, yeah. Yeah. I don't think I quite have it. That's Atiya, and that's Zawahiri. I don't want to drag you through this. But in either chapter 13 or chapter 14, you will find Osama bin Laden saying just about the same thing. It's really remarkable. You put those two side by side, and it's almost word for word. And so that's extremism. The Arab Spring revolutions and Euromaidan. I mean, when I was hearing about the Arab Spring revolutions at first, I kept hearing about youth bulge and these sort of structural things. When I went and actually traveled across Morocco, Tunisia, I skipped Libya, Egypt for Admiral Mullen, it was all about corruption. I mean, it could not have been more explicit. It was, people behind bars, pictures of ministers behind bars. And today we are almost living in a second Arab Spring. It's absolutely remarkable, but it's from so many different countries that we're seeing it, separately. But there's Guatemala, Brazil. I just did a paper on anti-corruption protests. Guatemala, Brazil, Burkina Faso, South Africa, Romania, lots of Eastern Europe countries are in it, but I looked at Romania, Lebanon, the U-Stink protests, South Korea. It is now the number one cause of the toppling of rulers, of governments. Iceland, they kicked out their prime minister fell after the Panama Papers came out. These are massive popular movements against corruption. What I discovered, however, that's really problematic is that there's a tendency to sort of see the individual head of state as the personification of the corruption that bothers everyone, and to go for the unseating of the head of state. A network is an incredibly resilient structure. Think of a fishing net. And the fishermen will mend their nets all winter, but if you've got one of those strands broken on a fishing net, the net still works. And so I've been watching all over the place, kleptocratic networks basically sacrifice their rulers, their heads, to the crowd. And I've also seen them fight back very effectively by playing on identity divides. That's one of the most successful ways that kleptocratic networks stay in power. In Lebanon, it was particularly egregious because they were actually sending text messages to individuals telling them, don't go out to that protest. It's an Amal protest, or that protest is a Hezbollah protest. But tragically, it wasn't just a network that was doing that. The opposition was also playing up the identity divide. So it was largely a bunch of, who started it was largely citified, educated Beirutis. After a while, people start coming down from the hills, and the poor Shiite kids start flooding up from the southern ghettos of Beirut. And that was, the leaders of the movement, they didn't really want to be with the Shiite riffraff. So they separated it out and told the Shiite riffraff to go to this square while they kept Martyr Square, and they even prevented their own people from going to join the Shiite riffraff. So, of course, the movement fell apart. I think that has very profound implications for us, where I have found the focus on identity divides is as intense on both sides of the political divide. It really is. So the tax law, turns out, I didn't learn this until last week, our tax law, new tax law, still gives a subsidy to offshoring business operations. If you run your business entirely in the United States, you pay 21% tax. If you move your operations offshore, you pay at most 10%, and usually 0. I haven't heard a lot of Democrats screaming about that. I heard a lot of repeal Obamacare, repeal from the day it passed, repeal. Where is our repeal the tax law? Why is that not the, and so I'm hearing DACA, 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 and I get that, and that's important. I'm just saying the proportion of focus on DACA, which frankly is an identity issue, as opposed to economic justice, is pretty shocking. And we can go down that, lane. There's a lot more to be said about that. Okay, I think I'll sort of think about wrapping up now, but what I want to say is, when I wrote this book, what I meant by why corruption threatens global security is that it drives people to extremes. Extremes like joining extremist movements, having revolutions, which devolve into massively bloody disasters like Syria, or voting for, comedians like they did in Italy or Guatemala or but that is, extreme voting patterns, right? And that's what I thought was the danger of corruption. Now, I think that the kind of network corruption I've been talking about is the danger in and of itself. That is the threat to government in the public interest. And it's really insidious. It's not the Nazis or the Soviets. It doesn't wear a uniform. It's all of us. And so it's going to be really hard to fight. And let me just say, again, are there any historians in the room? Yeah, right. So roughly, right? Back before democracy, and I know that goes back quite a while because we've had democracy in a number of different eras, but the deal was the ruler goes through a kind of sacred rite, a rite of passage, a coronation or an investiture, wherein he or she is, in a kind of sacred way, expected to lay aside, usually his, private identity as a private person, and take on this new identity as defender of the public interest. And Henry IV, first and second parts, really get at that issue. There's someone who, at least in the play, does that. And it's pretty surprising to a bunch of his pals from when he was a private person. But most of them didn't, right? Most rulers didn't do that. And so human society started coming up with constraints to force them to think and act in the public interest. And I found fascinating, as I thought about it, that the first of those constraints was law, right? The first constraint was not suffrage, was not voting. So in democracy, in the path toward democracy, the first step along that path is force the king to submit to law. Magna Carta, Dutch Revolt, English Civil War. In the English Civil War, which comes up in Thieves of State, what's so fascinating is Charles I gets put on trial. They could have just assassinated the guy in a dark corner. They decided to put him on trial. And Charles got it. He understood how incredibly revolutionary that was, to subject the ruler to laws made by men. And so he refused to enter a plea. He knew he would die. That was a guaranteed death sentence. But for him, the principle was important enough that he accepted certain death rather than subject himself to law. The second constraint is suffrage. But as I've just described, these kleptocratic networks have significantly disabled both of these constraints. And that's the situation that we're up against. So, if we believe in government by and for the people, whatever our political persuasion, that's what's important here, we're going to have to fight for it. And we have to start now. And I think, I'm not quite sure yet what form that fight needs to take for each of us. But I've just got a couple of little points here. Number one, and I really wish I had made this point at a prior talk I just gave at the World Affairs Council at Hilton Head in South Carolina. So those people most of them have a fair amount of income, or did. First point, pay your taxes. I think pretty much everyone in this room is unlikely to be the type of person who spends a lot of money on getting out of their taxes. But I suspect that people at my Hilton Head audience, maybe they are that kind of people, or some of them might have been. Pay your taxes, right? Like that's part of, and stop, like we have to stop whining about them. The teachers in West Virginia, the reason they're being paid with a slingshot is because no one in West Virginia wants to pay their taxes. Stop turning a blind eye to our own side sins. That's, like there's a tendency to say corruption happens over there. We almost have to look at our own political family first. Then transparency is really important. This business of being able to start a company without declaring the real beneficiary of that company is ridiculous. There's now a law or a bill making its way through Congress to end what's called beneficial ownership secrecy. So you might take a look at that, and I know it sounds obscure compared to the other things you're calling your members of Congress about, but that's an important one. Revolving door, I think, is really a really big issue. In terms of the reform program that we're going to need, we're going to have to limit the ability of people to go directly from industry into government and directly from government back into industry. We're seeing it now where we've got former lobbyists are now running the agencies that they lobbied against. And we saw it in the opioid crisis. Unbelievable investigative work by the Washington Post and 60 Minutes. Where DEA prosecutors literally walked out the door, got hired by the drug companies, and took the entire prosecution strategy over to the drug companies. Meanwhile, drug companies are leaning on Congress and the DEA to quit it. And that's why we have 200,000 people dead. It's absolutely unconscionable. And then finally, and what I'm thinking about some of these issues like transparency and revolving door and disclose your tax returns and things like that. I mean, we could start thinking about a litmus. What about building, just like there was the no new taxes test for candidates or the pro-abortion or anti-abortion test, what about having 3 or 5 integrity in government points that we as citizens would start to champion? Doesn't matter who you vote for, Republican or Democrat, anyone who wants our support needs to sign up to the following 3 or 4 principles and then hold them accountable. And finally, we got to figure out how to honor values other than that stuff. And that means people, and that's a lot of the people in this room, I think, but people who have chosen a profession that does something other than maximize their returns, those people need to be able to make a decent living. So they don't need to be rewarded with more money, but they need to have enough money to have a dignified life. And we have to figure out how we reallocate things so that it's not all, the people in the competition for zeros are sucking all of the resources out of the rest of the system. Thank you very much. For thoughts, questions, arguments. Don't be shy.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks. I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
I guess my question is slightly...
Would you mind just telling me who you are and just one word about where you fit into this world here? Sorry.
Oh, my goodness. I'm Dave Minchin. I'm a 4th-year PhD student.
Okay.
We actually chatted on the phone about 2 years ago.
All right.
On the way to Iraq. You were really helpful, so thank you for that. The question is more definitional.
Yeah.
And it's about what I see as kind of a blurry line.
Yeah.
As these networks begin to capture government, it seems that a scenario in which a extractive network is able to fully capture a government essentially becomes an autocracy.
Yeah.
That at this point they have a selectorate to which they might be legitimate, right? And that this could be a successful end to a network, that they could transform from a country like, say, Afghanistan to something that looks more like Azerbaijan, something that looks more like China, right? Where you essentially have a legitimate extractive authority. And so my question is, how do you differentiate between corruption and taxation if the money isn't being used, for example, to buy private jets and leave the country or buy apartments and...
Well, it is. I mean, look at China. It is being used. So that's the differentiation. Taxation, the money goes back into the public good. Now, you may disagree with how that money is spent. One might disagree. But it is not going into pockets.
But the police officer who extracts the bribe, he's not sending that money to buy a house.
Sure he is.
No.
Oh,
Not
yes,
in-
he
not in
is.
the US.
No.
That
But
money's
the
back
police
to the
officer
economy.
isn't extracting bribes in the U.S. But in Afghanistan, believe me, the police officers who are taking bribes are doing way better than their neighbors who are living honestly. Now, they may not be sending it to Dubai, but believe me, that was one of the problems, is the people skimming the development contracts. You had, 17-year-olds driving $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 cars, and everybody knew how much, because they could speak English and they got jobs with contractors and things like that. And it was salary, but it was also what they were skimming on the side. So that is the difference. The difference is when the money is siphoned off for private ends, which it is in Azerbaijan and it is in China. And that's why Xi is running an anti-corruption campaign. Now, he may be doing it also to, consolidate his power. But corruption's a gigantic issue in China. We don't see it because there isn't, we're not, but there are there are like every year about 100,000 demonstrations, large and small, in China over corruption. We're not seeing it because they're able to keep a lid on it, but that's an incredibly corrupt, so it's not really legitimate.
I guess my question is about how it then leads to the insurgency part. So why do some states manage to have corruption, succeed in building...
I would argue that it will always blow up at one point or another. It will blow up in different ways, but it'll blow up. So you don't always get a religious insurgency. You might get an ideological insurgency. You might get a revolution. You might get mass public protests. It's so another kind of visual I have, and I've never really taken this as far as I should, but it's a kind of corruption and security map, and it's the different types of security crisis that have been generated by acute corruption, and then the watch countries. But that is a good question, and so, because why is the population in Russia not really blowing up? They did though. Iran also, they did in 2009. We forget you don't always succeed in toppling the government, but you can even consider the Iranian Revolution to be one of these. And so, but astute use of national mythology and identity divides is one way the network stays in control. So in Russia, the whole nationalistic rhetoric and Mother Russia and stuff like that is keeping people largely in line. And Putin is really working that very well. In India, they still have the vestiges of a system that said, oh, the people on top are meant to be on top. It's supposed to be that way. That's the national mythology. It's starting to break down, but not fast enough. And I was just in Nepal doing a workshop on how their kleptocratic network is structured, and this came out, that this is a real break on public protest against it. And frankly, I would submit that in the United States, the myth of upward mobility has also kept us a lot quieter than we ought to be over the last 30 years. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. Some of your recommendations included asking people who are benefiting from the system to not benefit from the system as much. For example, pay your taxes.
Pay your taxes.
And it seems to me that is a little bit
Naive.
well, not naive, but utopian, shall we say? And so my question to you is that really the suggestion that you want to make to those people, or I mean, are you truly wasting your time for the most part? Some of them might resonate.
Well,
But how do you, in other words, another way of rephrasing the question. How do you really expect to generate any kind of support from the people who are benefiting from the system?
okay. I think not from real network members, no. There you have to work on incentive structures. But this was a crowd that thinks, these were the soft enablers, this particular crowd. They thought of themselves, think of themselves as incredibly upstanding. They were in love with this. I mean, I obviously didn't give the exact same talk, but it was these sorts of issues. They loved it. And that's why they were the right ones, to really sort of right then and there say, hey, we're all playing a little bit hypocritical here. But I do think those of us who do want to get into the fight, there are things we can do in our everyday lives. And that is one of them. I mean, I suspect that, I doubt that many people in this room are spending a lot of money evading taxes. However, I suspect that we might, be trying to minimize as much as we can. And what I'm suggesting is, don't put that much energy into it. Or what I'm suggesting is, if your credit card comes from one of the banks that was really significant in bringing about, the crash of 2008. And I didn't think of this until, I bank at HSBC, which is one of the classic facilitators, right, in France. And I intended for the last 5 years to get out of that bank, and I still haven't bothered, right? We have to inconvenience ourselves. I did switch finally, go online, and I don't know what I Googled to get the Coalition for Banking on Values. And it's an international coalition of banks that agree to sign up to a certain series of principles in terms of how they, who they lend to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I decided, heck, I'm going to get my credit card from one of them. I think there are ways in our daily lives that we can begin working to change the incentive structure. That's not going to defeat this hydra. I get it. You're exactly right. The hydra is going to have to get defeated by much more militant action, much more militant action. But what I'm saying from my experience with the protests in Guatemala and Brazil and Burkina Faso, I think that's an interesting one to watch. I think they're doing pretty well. But the window of opportunity for reform will be really narrow. At some point, the head of this hydra is going to come down, of our hydra is going to come down. The question is, number one, will the network stay in place? So let me again just get real explicit about the implications for America. I'm not a big impeachment fan. I think that if impeachment is warranted, that's fine. But don't assume that impeachment would be a panacea, because the rest of the network is still going to be in place. So in a way, it's going to have to be much deeper than that. And then there's going to be a very quick window of opportunity before the network regroups. And that means, the reform package better be ready to go. And we all better be ready to fight to put it in there. And that's why, some of those items were on it. I think it'll be interesting to watch. It's interesting to watch the gun issue right now and watch, so there's a moment where it's been a moment of opportunity, window of opportunity. The kids are doing great. The NRA and company is scrambling a little bit, but not for long. Not for long. And they are already, you already see the representatives pivoting to, you say, what are you going to do about gun control? And they say, mental health is really a big problem. They've got their talking points, and has anyone read Dark Money? All right, if you were interested in this topic, go home and buy it right now. And this is a book that I've had on my shelf for a year. and I've only started reading it right now. And what is so, I think she leaves out half the story, which is the kind of defection of the other political camp, frankly, to the same principles. But it tells the story of a group of people who considered themselves completely shut out from politics and where it was going, and policy, national policy on economic issues. They had a whole lot of money, basically infinite money, and they set out over a 30-year period to win control over our political economy. They mostly come out of the fossil fuel world, not exclusively, but largely, massively, it's the billionaires. It's a subset of billionaires. And what's so stunning to me is, number one, they felt as shut out as, let's say, Bernie supporters do right now. And they methodically planned what they were going to do about it. And they had a really long view. And at the moment, they achieved what they were after. So the point there is, yes, it's possible, but it's going to take real sustained effort. And unfortunately, most of the money is on the side of government, not in the public interest. Most of the money is on the side of government in corporate interest. But as I say, the other thing that's really dangerous is the identity divide. And until we can get the single mother from the ghetto in Baltimore together with the unemployed coal miner in West Virginia or in Western Maryland, and there's a college that does that. It's a UMD campus, it's Frostburg. It just happens its student body is precisely that. It's kids from the inner city of Baltimore and farmers' kids from West Virginia. And I'm really interested to know, do they find common ground, or do they spend their time focusing? Do they find the common economic justice ground, or do they focus on their cultural identity divides? And I don't know that yet. Yeah.
You please keep at this, writing and exploring, because you are definitely, you might be insulted by this, one of the 5 best guest speakers I've ever heard at Yale.
Wow.
In my 4 years here.
Wow.
I almost don't dare ask you what we should do about our electoral system in the United States, which makes such cowards out of everybody, and it would of me too.
Get the money out of it. Get the money out of it. We have got, if it has to be a constitutional amendment, if it's terrifying to go down the constitutional road, I don't know. The idea that money equals speech is so utterly preposterous. The idea that you can have secret money in electoral campaigns is completely preposterous. How can that have happened? How can that have happened? In France, where I'm actually a resident, they have campaign spending limits. They have extremely rigorous rules about what you can spend campaign money on. So, for example, you can't just put posters up anywhere. There is a set of boards in front of the polling places. That's where you're allowed to put posters. We've got to, and I feel that's more important even than electoral college and stuff like that. I frankly am, I mean, I'm not decided about whether the Electoral College is a bad thing or not. I mean, I do feel perhaps that some of the underrepresented communities, like rural communities, deserve, more of a say than their absolute population might give them. But, and it's interesting, there's a wonderful writer from Kentucky called Wendell Berry. Have you ever heard of him? Yes. He writes, he's incredible. He's about 90 now, I think. But this is a guy who grew up in Kentucky, was a journalist for a while, went back and started farming and with horses. And he's got really interesting things to say about the rural economy and the whole sort of system and disenfranchisement of rural people. So he's writing way before what's happened recently, but it almost presages it. But one of the things he did in a 2005 or 6 essay was to substitute the words the way that small town people are referred to, like in a New Yorker or New York Review of Books was one of the articles that he quoted. Narrow-minded like a country lawyer, stuff like that. And he said, just exchange Jew or black or whatever. Like, nobody could get away with talking like that about country people. The contempt that pours out of urban people about country people is true. So anyway, that's about electoral college. I'm not sure what's the way to go on that, but the money in the system it's so bad. So first of all, it allows for the capture of our elected officials. But even where the money doesn't actually buy victory, which it doesn't always, it creates a primary. If you need X million dollars in order to run for office, it means you have to spend X amount of your time with people who are capable of giving that much money. Now, there are lots of corollaries to that. That means you're listening to what they want more than you're listening to what ordinary people want. But it also means you have to be the kind of person who's comfortable in a room with people who could give you $500,000. I'm not sure I want all of my elected representatives to be people who are comfortable in that kind of room, of a community, So for me, that's number one. And I don't know how we do it. Given Citizens United, I guess you need a constitutional amendment. I don't know. We don't. It could be overturned, but not by this court. So, sir, in the back, and then down there.
I'd like to raise 2 points.
Yeah.
One is there seems to be a movement toward creating a new constitutional convention which can go through state legislatures. And I'm hearing, I may be wrong, that we're getting close, particularly since there are so many Republican-controlled state legislatures. If you know about it, I'd like to.
I don't. But you're saying it would be a sort of red map applied to the Constitution?
I'm saying that red states are asking their legislatures
Right.
to call for.
Right.
it's in the
What I meant by red map is red map was the plan to redraw the districts, which went via first capturing state legislatures, and then they use big data to draw these ridiculous districts. Now the next,
new constitution.
I wouldn't be surprised. I have not heard this, but these guys are that strategic. Yeah.
And the second question is about social media
Yeah.
and where it fits into your thinking at the moment about the risks.
Really interesting question. I think that social media has facilitated some of the protests that we've seen. We've obviously seen now social media being weaponized by anti-democratic individuals and institutions and forces. But I think it's a tool, not an end in itself, and a tool can be used for good or for ill. It kind of comes to that. But interestingly, in Burkina Faso, I talked to some of the people who had helped generate the gigantic protest there. And it was like rap singers and stuff like that. And they used social media, but they also did what they called citizenship caravans. And they would drive their motorcycles into the neighborhoods. They'd set up a stage, have a concert, and then at intermission, they'd have a debate about citizenship. And they'd be talking about, so they did retail politics as a, as a festive kind of thing. And then they not only toppled a dictator, they also thwarted an attempted coup to reinstate the network. So that was pretty cool. So I actually am thinking in those directions too. I mean, I finally started tweeting. not Facebook. It's just too much self-exposure. I just, but tweeting, and it was Trump that got me to tweet, because I realized that he's actually conveying, original material. And so, for example, I did a Rachel Maddow interview, and I really, damn it, I forgot to say the following 3 things. So I thought, wow, if I could tweet those, and then, so, but I have the feeling that the wave is cresting on social media. The other really interesting thing about social media is that it makes it harder for these guys to hide. So one of the really interesting elements of the Arab Spring was Bahrain. I don't know if anyone remember. Bahrain is this, it's like the Princess and the Pea. Bahrain is the pea that sits between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it is, I think, 1/5 the size of Rhode Island and has the population of Rhode Island. And as its population discovered because of Google Maps, that population is shoved down into 1/3 of the island. And that's part of what sent them over the edge during the Arab Spring, was those maps came out and they realized, oh my God, this is like the West Bank. This is like the Shiite West Bank. They're sitting in this tiny little, while the royal family has 2/3 of the island. And they had 1/3 of the total population in the streets. You had one.
I'm from Kentucky.
All right, so you know Wendell Berry.
Yeah.
Is the guy still alive?
I think so.
I want to go visit him. I think he's an absolute, talk about a national treasure.
Yeah. Well, here's my question. I was surprised when you said about taxes. I'm one of the people who occasionally thinks about not paying my taxes because of like 55% of it goes to national security, et cetera, et cetera. So I was surprised.
Well, I think that's an issue. But then, once you've paid your taxes, then you start leaning on your representatives to reduce the defense budget. But not paying taxes means your teachers don't get paid, no public anything. And it means that, so that's a separate issue. But I believe in the public service, and then we can get into an argument about what our taxes are paid for, or what they're used for. And, there are certainly lines that a government could cross, like if our government truly becomes captured, there are lines that it might cross that would cause me to say, okay, I go into revolt. But at that point, then you're in revolt. And we might have to get there. This could get extremely ugly. Let me just point to another, I don't want to be too alarmist, but kleptocratic networks, everywhere I've looked at them, have an informal instrument of force at their disposal. So in Honduras, you guys remember the kids who were streaming across the border and still are starting 2014. So I kept hearing about gang extortion, gang extortion, gang extortion. When I got there, I started thinking about it. I said, wait a second, gang extortion. Where I come from, the police extort. And I said, I wonder if the police are outsourcing their extortion to the gangs. Bingo. So the gangs serve as an informal auxiliary for the police. They extort for the police, keeping some. So basically, the police lets them extort so long as they pay some up the line. And then when the police need to rub somebody out, they send the gangs after them. So in Egypt, you had the thugs, on the camels that went into Tahrir Square. So think back to Charlottesville. That was described often as, the president is cozying up to his voting base. I said, no, I don't think so. I think that's the president cultivating a potential informal instrument of force. If the wolves really start snapping at his door, might he incite riot? I think it's not impossible.
Why would the NRA not be such a...
Exactly. Exactly. But I'm not sure those are mutually exclusive.
It's something completely inexplicable. It's not just the gun makers and the selling of guns. There's not enough there. But I'm a student of the Middle Ages. I always felt that, you know, I'm a student of the future in the sense that private armies
Exactly.
are ready to.
Exactly. Exactly.
My name is Gerardo. I'm a social worker. You mentioned the Panama Papers.
Yeah.
And one of the consequences, like a head of a state as an island lost his job. Could you also elaborate how come that some other presidents, like the president of Argentina, has been mentioned, but there was nothing really that happened?
That's a version of, you know what, and I made you introduce yourself, and then I totally forgot to make everybody else. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to pick on you. I meant to pick on everybody, and I now realize, you're Gabe, right?
Dave.
Dave, right. So that's a version of Dave's question. Why does it explode in some places and not in others? And that's a little hard to tell. All I can say is, you know, so Iceland had been through a really significant crisis after the economic collapse of 2008. And they did a really interesting thing, which is, first of all, a prime minister fell over that one too. And then there was a constitution writing exercise where it was online. And ordinary citizens could recommend modifications and stuff like that. They could make recommendations. And so they revised their constitution, but the network beat them off, and it never passed in parliament. So there was already quite a, you know, intense anger among the people of Iceland about this network there. So I think they were primed, you know, to go after him. Argentina, I just don't know. And it's funny, we have at Carnegie one Latin America guy, Moises Naim, who's Venezuelan and a former minister, I think. And I took my whole kleptocratic network analysis to him and said, I'm planning on doing Honduras. And he looked at the thing and he said, oh my God, this is great. Don't waste your time on Honduras, do Argentina. And I was like, Moses, I have never set foot in Latin America before. Please, let me have a little country first. And it took me a year to do Honduras. But so I just don't feel that I know enough intimately about Argentina, say, to know what the secret sauce is that makes people, you know, rise up. I mean, what was it? That's the spark. Why was it? What was it in Korea? South Korea, what was it in, you know, and in South Korea was revelations, but somehow they were even more shocking. Maybe whatever came out in Panama Papers wasn't quite shocking enough to the people of Argentina that it put them into the streets.
Well, why don't we leave it there?
Okay.
Let you off the hook, and everyone is invited to a reception up on the second floor in Moose Hall.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.